"My hands are shaking, Mr. Presley. I can't cut your hair like this," stammered Frank Morrison, the 52-year-old barber who had been cutting hair in the small Tennessee town of Brownsville for 25 years. When Elvis Presley walked into Morrison's barbershop on that quiet Tuesday afternoon in 1973, Frank's hands began trembling so violently that he dropped his razor on the floor. It wasn't just nerves. It was the overwhelming realization that the king of rock and roll had chosen his humble barbershop over any fancy salon in Memphis. But what Frank didn't know was that Elvis had been driving through small towns for weeks, looking for something real, something authentic, and what happened during that haircut would change not just Frank's life, but his 12-year-old son's musical future forever. But to understand why Elvis chose a nervous small-town barber over celebrity stylists, you need to know about the conversation he overheard that broke his heart. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when Elvis had grown tired of the artificial world that surrounded him in Memphis. Every interaction felt scripted, every conversation felt rehearsed, and every person he met seemed to want something from him rather than simply treating him as a human being. He had been driving aimlessly through the countryside, trying to recapture the feeling of authenticity that had once made music magical for him. Elvis had grown up in small towns like Brownsville, where barbers knew their customers' families for generations, where a haircut came with genuine conversation and honest human connection. He missed the simplicity of those interactions, the way people could just be themselves without pretense or performance. That Tuesday afternoon, Elvis was driving through Brownsville when he spotted Morrison's barber shop, a small building with a traditional red, white, and blue barber pole spinning slowly in the autumn breeze. Through the window, he could see Frank Morrison sweeping hair from the floor, preparing to close for the day. Something about the scene reminded Elvis of his childhood, of simpler times when getting a haircut was about more than just grooming. It was about community, about belonging, about being treated like family. Elvis parked his car and walked into the shop, removing his sunglasses and baseball cap as he entered. Frank looked up from his sweeping and nearly dropped his broom. The king of rock and roll was standing in his tiny barber shop, looking around at the faded photographs on the walls, the worn leather chair, the simple tools of a trade that had sustained Frank's family for decades. "Good afternoon, sir," Frank managed to say, his voice barely steady. Are you really him?" Elvis smiled, the genuine humble expression that had charmed millions but had become increasingly rare in his public appearances. "I'm just a man who needs a haircut, if you've got time for one more customer." Frank's hands began shaking immediately. This was Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer in the world, standing in his modest barber shop in rural Tennessee. Frank had cut hair for farmers, mechanics, store clerks, and retired railroad workers, but he had never imagined that someone of Elvis's stature would ever walk through his door. "I don't know if I can do this," Frank admitted, looking down at his trembling hands. "My hands are shaking, Mr. Presley. I can't cut your hair like this. I might hurt you, or mess it up, or..." Elvis walked over and gently placed his hand on Frank's shoulder. "Frank," he said, having noticed the name embroidered on the barber's shirt, "I want you to do me a favor. I want you to treat me exactly like you'd treat any other customer who walked in here. No special treatment, no nervousness, no worry about messing up. Just give me the same quality haircut you've been giving folks in this town for 25 years. Frank looked up at Elvis, searching his eyes for any sign of insincerity or condescension. Instead, he saw genuine kindness, real humility, and something that looked like longing, as if Elvis desperately wanted to experience what it felt like to be treated normally. "Are you sure?" Frank asked. "I mean, you could go to any salon in Memphis, any celebrity stylist in Nashville. Why would you want me to cut your hair?" Elvis settled into the worn leather barber chair, a piece of furniture that had probably been there since the 1940s, and looked at Frank through the mirror. "Because, Frank, I don't want a celebrity stylist. I don't want someone who's going to fuss over me or treat me like I'm different from everyone else. I want someone who's going to give me an honest haircut, and maybe some honest conversation." Frank took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been cutting hair since he was 18 years old, learning the trade from his own father, who had learned it from his grandfather. 3 generations of Morrison men had stood behind barber chairs, serving their community with skill, integrity, and genuine care for their customers. "All right then," Frank said, picking up his scissors with hands that were gradually becoming steadier. "Just a trim, or are you looking for something specific?" "Whatever you think looks best," Elvis replied. "I trust your judgment." As Frank began working, something remarkable happened. The artificial barrier between celebrity and ordinary citizen began to dissolve. Elvis wasn't performing or posturing. He was simply being himself, enjoying the simple pleasure of a good haircut and genuine conversation. Frank wasn't starstruck or nervous. He was doing what he did best, treating a customer with the same care and attention he gave to everyone who sat in his chair. "You've got a nice setup here, Frank," Elvis said as Frank worked around his sideburns with practiced precision. "How long have you been in this location?" 22 years in this building, Frank replied, beginning to relax as he focused on his craft. "My daddy taught me the trade, and his daddy before him. We've been cutting hair in this town for almost 70 years. Elvis nodded appreciatively. "That's something special, having that kind of continuity, that connection to community. I bet you know every family in town." "Most of them," Frank agreed. "I've cut hair for 3 generations of some families, watched kids grow up, seen them graduate, get married, have kids of their own. It's been an honor, really, being part of people's lives like that." As they talked, a sound drifted down from the apartment above the barbershop, the gentle, haunting melody of a piano being played with remarkable skill and emotion. Elvis paused in his conversation, listening intently to the music that seemed to fill the small space with unexpected beauty. "That's beautiful," Elvis said quietly. "Who's playing?" Frank's expression changed, a mixture of pride and sadness crossing his face. "That's my son, Tommy. He's 12 years old, and he's been teaching himself to play on that old piano upstairs. It came with the building when I bought it, and it hasn't been tuned in probably 10 years, but he loves it." Elvis listened more carefully to the music. Despite the instrument's obvious limitations, the playing demonstrated remarkable talent, an understanding of melody, rhythm, and emotion that suggested natural musical ability far beyond what most 12-year-olds could achieve. "He's very talented," Elvis said. "Does he take lessons?" Frank's hands paused in their work, and Elvis could see in the mirror that the question had touched something painful. "No, sir. I wish I could afford to get him proper instruction, but, well, barbering in a small town doesn't exactly make you rich. I do the best I can, but piano lessons, and a proper piano, and all the things he'd need to really develop his talent, it's just not possible on what I make." Elvis heard something in Frank's voice that went beyond simple financial limitation. There was a deeper pain there, something that spoke to dreams deferred and opportunities missed. "Tell me about Tommy," Elvis said gently. "How did he get interested in music?" Frank continued cutting, but Elvis could see his hands were less steady now, not from nervousness but from emotion. "He's always been drawn to music, even as a little boy. When he was 5 or 6, he'd hum along to the radio, and he always seemed to know the melodies perfectly, even complicated ones. When he found that old piano upstairs, it was like he'd found a part of himself he didn't know was missing." Elvis nodded, understanding completely. "Music has a way of calling to some people, doesn't it?" "It does," Frank agreed. "And Tommy has something special. I may not know much about music, but I can hear it in the way he plays. He's got a gift, Mr. Presley. But gifts don't mean much if you can't afford to develop them." The pain in Frank's voice was unmistakable now, and Elvis began to understand why this conversation was affecting him so deeply. Here was a father who recognized his child's extraordinary talent, but was powerless to help him develop it. A situation that resonated with Elvis's own understanding of how important it was to nurture musical ability when it appeared. "What about his mother?" Elvis asked gently. "Does she play music?" Frank's hands stopped completely, and for a moment the only sound in the barbershop was Tommy's piano playing from upstairs. "His mother passed away 3 years ago," Frank said quietly. "Cancer. She was the one who really understood Tommy's music. She used to sing with him, help him figure out melodies. She had a beautiful voice, and she could play a little piano herself. Elvis felt his heart tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss, Frank." "Thank you," Frank replied, resuming his work with careful, precise movements. "She made me promise before she died that I'd do everything I could to help Tommy with his music. She said it was too important to let slip away. But after the medical bills and the funeral expenses, and just trying to keep this place running and food on the table, there's not much left over for music lessons." Elvis sat quietly, listening to the piano music that continued to drift down from upstairs, understanding now why it sounded so poignant, so filled with longing. This was a child with genuine talent, pouring his heart into an instrument that couldn't properly express what he was trying to say, dreaming of musical possibilities that seemed forever out of reach. "Frank," Elvis said carefully, "would you mind if I met Tommy? I'd like to hear him play in person." Frank looked surprised. "You'd really want to meet him? I mean, he's just a kid, and he's not trained or anything. He just plays what he feels." "Those are often the best kind of musicians," Elvis replied. "The ones who play from the heart instead of just from technique." Frank finished the haircut, brushing the loose hair from Elvis's shoulders and stepping back to examine his work. It was a simple, clean cut, nothing fancy or stylized, just the kind of honest, quality work that Frank had been providing for 25 years. "What do you think?" Frank asked, holding up a mirror so Elvis could see the back. Elvis examined the haircut carefully, then smiled genuinely. "It's perfect, Frank. Exactly what I was hoping for. You're a real craftsman." Frank beamed with pride, but before he could respond, the piano music from upstairs stopped, and they could hear footsteps on the stairs that led down to the barbershop. A moment later, a boy appeared in the doorway, 12 years old, with tousled brown hair and curious eyes that widened when he saw Elvis sitting in his father's chair. "Dad," Tommy said uncertainly. "Is that Tommy?" Frank said gently. "This is Mr. Presley. He was just getting a haircut, and heard you playing upstairs." "Mr. Presley, this is my son Tommy." Elvis stood up and extended his hand to the boy, treating him with the same respect he would show an adult. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tommy. I was listening to your playing, and I have to say, you have real talent." Tommy shook Elvis's hand, still clearly amazed by who was standing in his father's barbershop. "Thank you, sir. I love your music. I try to play some of your songs sometimes, but they don't sound right on our piano. I'd love to hear you play," Elvis said. "Would that be all right?" Tommy looked at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Sure," Tommy said, his initial shyness beginning to fade. "But our piano isn't very good. It's really old and out of tune. The instrument doesn't matter as much as the musician." Elvis replied, "Let's go have a listen." The three of them climbed the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the barbershop. It was a modest home, clean but clearly furnished with second-hand furniture, and decorated with family photographs that showed happier times when Tommy's mother was still alive. In one corner of the living room sat an old upright piano, probably dating from the 1940s, with several keys that stuck and a sound that spoke of years without professional maintenance. "This is it," Tommy said, settling onto the worn piano bench. "It's not much, but it's all we have." Elvis pulled up a chair next to the piano, giving Tommy his full attention. "What would you like to play for me?" Tommy thought for a moment, then placed his hands on the keys. "I've been working on this piece I heard on the radio. I think it's called Clair de Lune. I don't know if I'm playing it right, but I love the way it sounds." What followed was 7 minutes of the most remarkable music Elvis had heard in years. Despite the piano's limitations, despite having no formal training, despite learning everything by ear, Tommy played Debussy's masterpiece with an understanding of its emotional depth that took Elvis's breath away. The boy wasn't just hitting the right notes, he was interpreting the music, finding ways to express its beauty even through an instrument that fought him at every turn. When Tommy finished, the small apartment was filled with silence. Frank stood in the doorway, tears in his eyes, knowing that he was witnessing something extraordinary, but feeling helpless to nurture it properly. Elvis sat motionless, deeply moved by what he had just heard. "Tommy," Elvis said finally. "That was beautiful. How long have you been playing?" "About 3 years," Tommy replied. "Since we moved into this apartment, Mom used to help me figure out the melodies, but mostly I just listen to music on the radio and try to copy what I hear." Elvis looked around the modest apartment, taking in the evidence of Frank's struggles to provide for his son while honoring his late wife's wishes. There were music books from the library, obviously well used. There was a small radio, probably Tommy's primary connection to the musical world beyond Brownsville. And there was that old piano, giving its best effort to serve as the vehicle for a young boy's extraordinary dreams. "Tommy," Elvis said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. If you could have anything in the world to help with your music, what would it be?" Tommy thought carefully, as if he had been asked this question before, as if he had spent countless hours imagining possibilities that seemed impossible to achieve. "I guess I'd want a real piano," Tommy said quietly. "One that's tuned properly, where all the keys work, where the sound is clear and beautiful. And maybe I'd want someone to teach me how to read music properly, so I could play more complicated pieces, so I could learn the right techniques." Elvis nodded, understanding completely. "And what do you want to do with music when you grow up?" Tommy's eyes lit up with the kind of passion that Elvis recognized from his own childhood dreams. "I want to be a concert pianist. I want to play in big halls where people come just to hear the music. I want to learn all the great pieces, the ones by Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin. I want to make people feel the same way music makes me feel." Elvis looked at Frank, who was listening to his son's dreams with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Here was a father who would do anything to help his child achieve those dreams, but who was limited by circumstances beyond his control. "Frank," Elvis said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into the kitchen, leaving Tommy at the piano, where he had begun playing softly again, lost in his own musical world. "Frank," Elvis said quietly, "your son has something truly special. That's not just talent. That's a gift that needs to be developed and protected and nurtured." Frank nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, his mother knew it too, but I'm just a barber, Mr. Presley. I don't know anything about music, and I don't have the resources to get him what he needs." Elvis was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own musical journey, about the people who had recognized his talent and helped him develop it, about the responsibility that came with having the resources to make dreams come true. "Frank," Elvis said, "what if I told you that I'd like to help? What if I could arrange for Tommy to have access to proper instruments, professional instruction, maybe even the chance to study with some of the best piano teachers in the country?" Frank stared at Elvis, unable to process what he was hearing. "Mr. Presley, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept something like that. It would be too much." "Frank," Elvis said firmly, "let me tell you what I heard when Tommy played that piece. I heard the kind of natural musical understanding that can't be taught. It can only be nurtured. I heard a young man who has the potential to bring joy and beauty into thousands of people's lives through his music. That's not something you let slip away because of money." Elvis paused, looking back toward the living room where Tommy was still playing, completely absorbed in his music. "I grew up poor too, Frank. I know what it's like to have dreams that seem bigger than your circumstances, but I was lucky. People believed in me. People helped me when I needed help. People gave me opportunities that I couldn't have created for myself. Now I'm in a position to do the same thing for someone else." Frank wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness of this man who had walked into his barbershop as a stranger and was now offering to change his son's life. "But why?" Frank asked. "Why would you do this for us?" Elvis smiled, the same genuine humble expression that had put Frank at ease from the moment he entered the barbershop. "Because, Frank, I believe that music is one of God's greatest gifts to humanity, And when someone has the ability to create beauty through music, it's our responsibility to help them do it. Your son has that ability. Elvis walked back into the living room, where Tommy was playing a melody that sounded like a combination of classical technique and the gospel music that had influenced Elvis's own musical development. "Tommy," Elvis said, "how would you like to come visit me at Graceland next week?" Tommy's hands froze on the keys. "Graceland, your house, my home," Elvis corrected gently. "I have several pianos there, good ones, properly tuned with beautiful sound. I'd like you to play them, see what your music sounds like when you have the right instruments. And I'd like you to meet some people who might be able to help you with your musical education." Tommy looked at his father, who nodded with tears in his eyes, still overwhelmed by Elvis's offer. "Would that be all right?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. "More than all right," Elvis replied. "It would be my honor." The following week, Frank and Tommy made the drive to Memphis, both of them nervous and excited about what awaited them at Graceland. Elvis had arranged for them to stay in one of the guest rooms, ensuring that they felt welcome and comfortable in what was, after all, one of the most famous homes in America. When Tommy first sat down at the grand piano in Graceland's music room, the difference was immediately apparent. The instrument responded to his touch with clarity and richness that the old upright piano could never achieve. The sound that emerged was fuller, more nuanced, more capable of expressing the full range of Tommy's musical vision. Elvis had also arranged for Tommy to meet with several professional piano teachers, including a professor from the Memphis Conservatory of Music, who was immediately impressed by the boy's natural ability and his intuitive understanding of musical structure. "This young man has extraordinary potential," the professor told Elvis, after listening to Tommy play for an hour. "With proper instruction and consistent practice on quality instruments, he could easily develop into a professional-level pianist. His ear is exceptional, his touch is naturally expressive, and his musical instincts are remarkably mature." Elvis nodded, having expected exactly this kind of assessment. What would he need to reach that potential? Consistent lessons with a qualified instructor, at least 2 hours of practice daily on a properly maintained piano, exposure to a wide range of classical repertoire, and eventually, performance opportunities where he can develop his stage presence and learn to connect with audiences. Elvis looked at Frank, who was listening to this conversation with amazement and gratitude. "Frank, what do you think about Tommy spending his summers here in Memphis, working with teachers and practicing on proper instruments? During the school year, I could arrange for a piano teacher to come to Brownsville once a week, and we could get a good piano installed in your apartment." Frank struggled to find words to express his gratitude. "Mr. Presley, I don't know how I could ever repay you for something like this." "You don't repay a gift, Frank," Elvis replied. "You honor it by making the most of it. Tommy has a gift that needs to be developed, and I'm in a position to help make that happen. Someday, when Tommy is performing in concert halls and bringing joy to people through his music, that will be all the payment I need." Over the next several years, Tommy's musical development was remarkable. The summers he spent at Graceland working with professional instructors and practicing on world-class instruments accelerated his progress beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The piano that Elvis had installed in the Morrison apartment, a beautiful baby grand that had been professionally tuned and maintained, transformed Tommy's daily practice from a struggle against a failing instrument into a genuine exploration of musical possibilities. Frank watched his son grow not just as a musician but as a confident young man who understood that his dreams were achievable through hard work and dedication. The boy who had once played haunting melodies on a broken piano was developing into a serious classical musician with the technical skills and artistic vision to succeed at the highest levels. By the time Tommy turned 16, he was performing in youth competitions across the Southeast, consistently winning awards and earning recognition from professional musicians and music educators. His playing had evolved from purely intuitive expression to a sophisticated combination of technical mastery and emotional depth. Elvis attended several of Tommy's performances, always sitting quietly in the audience, never drawing attention to himself, simply enjoying the music, and taking satisfaction in knowing that his investment in a young man's dreams was paying dividends not just for Tommy and Frank, but for everyone who had the opportunity to hear Tommy play. The barbershop in Brownsville had become something of a local landmark, known throughout the region as the place where Elvis Presley had discovered a future concert pianist. Frank continued cutting hair, but he also took pride in being the father of a young musician who was gaining recognition for his talent and dedication. More importantly, the relationship between Elvis and the Morrison family had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared appreciation for music's power to transform lives. Elvis would often stop by the barbershop when he was traveling through the area, not just for haircuts but for the kind of authentic human connection that had drawn him there in the first place. When Tommy graduated from high school, he had been accepted to several prestigious music conservatories, with full scholarships that recognized both his talent and his potential. He chose the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most selective and respected music schools in the world. On the day before Tommy left for Philadelphia, Elvis visited the barbershop one final time. Frank gave him what had become a regular haircut, and Tommy played a farewell concert on the baby grand piano that had transformed his musical development. "I want you to know," Tommy told Elvis as they prepared to say goodbye, "that I understand what you've given me isn't just music lessons or a piano, or even the chance to study at Curtis. You've given me the belief that dreams can come true if someone cares enough to help make them happen." Elvis nodded, deeply moved by the young man's gratitude and maturity. "Tommy, you've given me something too. You've reminded me that the most important thing success can buy is the opportunity to help other people achieve their dreams." Frank stood beside his son, watching this exchange between the boy who had once played broken melodies on a broken piano and the man who had recognized the beauty in both the music and the musician. "Presley," Frank said, "you've kept the promise I made to my wife, that Tommy's music wouldn't be allowed to slip away. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't need to thank me, Frank," Elvis replied. "Just keep being the kind of father who recognizes what's valuable in his child and fights to protect it. That's the most important gift any parent can give." Today, more than 40 years later, Thomas Morrison is one of America's most respected classical pianists, performing with symphony orchestras around the world and serving as a professor at the same conservatory where he once studied. His concerts are known not just for their technical excellence, but for their emotional depth and the genuine connection he creates with his audiences. In interviews, Tommy always credits Elvis Presley with saving his musical career before it even began, but he also talks about the deeper lesson that experience taught him, that true success is measured not just by what you achieve, but by how you use your achievements to help others. The baby grand piano that Elvis installed in the Morrison apartment still sits in the same corner where the old upright piano once struggled to produce music. Tommy's children, Frank's grandchildren, now play that same instrument, continuing the musical tradition that began with a 12-year-old boy's dreams and a rock star's generosity. And in Brownsville, Tennessee, Morrison's barbershop still operates in the same location, still serving the community with the same dedication to quality and authentic human connection that attracted Elvis's attention on that Tuesday afternoon in 1973. The barber chair where Elvis sat is marked with a small plaque that reads, "Some gifts are too valuable to measure in money." Frank Morrison, now in his 80s, still cuts hair twice a week, though he has largely retired and turned the business over to his nephew. But he keeps regular hours on Tuesdays, the same day of the week when Elvis first walked into his shop, because he says it reminds him that you never know when an ordinary day might become extraordinary. The story of Elvis and the Morrison family became more than just a tale of individual generosity. It became an example of what's possible when people with resources choose to invest in human potential rather than material acquisition, when they recognize that the greatest legacy isn't what you accumulate for yourself, but what you make possible for others. If this incredible story of humility, recognition of talent, and life-changing generosity moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of nurturing dreams and recognizing potential wherever it appears. Because just like Elvis proved that Tuesday afternoon in Brownsville, sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from perfect instruments or fancy venues, but from the human heart's desire to create something meaningful, and from other people's willingness to help make that creation possible. But the impact of that Tuesday afternoon in 1973 extended far beyond one family's transformation. The story of Elvis's visit to Morrison's barbershop became legendary in Brownsville and surrounding communities, inspiring other adults to look more carefully at the children in their lives and recognize talents that might otherwise go unnoticed and undeveloped. Within 6 months of Elvis's visit, 3 other children in Brownsville had been identified as having exceptional abilities in various areas. Sarah Jenkins, whose mathematical genius had been dismissed as showing off, was enrolled in advanced courses at the regional university. Michael Rodriguez, whose artistic abilities had been seen as doodling in class, received art supplies and instruction that helped him develop his natural talent. Lisa Thompson, whose storytelling had been considered daydreaming, began writing and eventually published her first short story at age 14. The transformation wasn't limited to children. Adults in the community began to reconsider their own abandoned dreams and unrealized potential. Frank's example of recognizing and nurturing his son's gift despite financial limitations inspired other parents to find creative ways to support their children's interests and abilities. Maria Santos, who worked as a seamstress in town, had always made beautiful clothes for her family but never considered her skills professionally valuable. After hearing Tommy's story, she began taking orders from neighbors and eventually opened a small tailoring business that served the entire county. Her success allowed her to send her own daughter to college, something that had seemed impossible before she found the confidence to value her own abilities. The ripple effects continued to spread through the community and beyond. Local churches began offering after-school programs that focused on identifying and developing children's talents. The school district created new initiatives to support students with exceptional abilities in areas not traditionally emphasized in rural education. Most significantly, a foundation was established in honor of Tommy's transformation, funded initially by Elvis, but supported by community donations and eventually by grants from educational organizations. The Morrison Music Foundation provided instruments, lessons, and scholarships for musically talented children throughout rural Tennessee. Elvis's involvement with the foundation was typically humble and behind the scenes. He provided financial support, connected the organization with professional musicians and educators, and occasionally visited to hear young performers, but he never sought publicity or recognition for his contributions. Elvis understood that the goal wasn't to create little Elvis Presleys, explained Dr. Margaret Williams, the foundation's first director and a music education professor from Vanderbilt University. The goal was to help children become the best versions of themselves, to develop their own unique voices and artistic visions. The foundation's approach was holistic, recognizing that musical development required more than just technical instruction. Children participating in the program received not only music lessons but also exposure to different genres and styles, opportunities to perform for audiences, and mentorship from professional musicians who understood the challenges and rewards of musical careers. Tommy Morrison became the foundation's first and most visible success story, but he was far from the only one. Over the decades, the foundation helped hundreds of young musicians develop their talents, pursue advanced education, and build careers in music. Some became professional performers, playing with orchestras or pursuing solo careers. Others became music educators, passing their knowledge and passion on to new generations. Still others incorporated music into different careers, becoming music therapists, sound engineers, or arts administrators who worked to make music more accessible to others. But perhaps the most important impact was on the participants' understanding of their own potential and worth. Like Tommy, many of these young people came from families where higher education and professional careers in the arts seemed impossible dreams. The foundation provided not just practical support, but the psychological foundation that made ambitious goals seem achievable. What the foundation really taught us, reflected Maria Gonzalez, who received violin instruction through the program and eventually became concertmaster of a regional orchestra, was that talent isn't limited by circumstances. If you have ability, and you're willing to work hard, there are people who will help you succeed. The foundation's success attracted attention from music educators and youth development specialists around the country. The model it pioneered, Combining technical instruction with performance opportunities, mentorship, and community support was replicated in rural areas across the United States. Elvis continued his relationship with the foundation throughout the rest of his life, attending annual concerts where young participants performed and occasionally offering encouragement to students who were struggling with the challenges of pursuing musical careers. His approach with these young musicians was similar to what he had demonstrated with Tommy: genuine respect for their abilities, practical advice about the music industry, and encouragement to develop their own artistic voices rather than trying to imitate others. Elvis had a special gift for seeing potential in young people, remembered James Patterson, who received foundation support as a teenage guitarist and later became a successful recording artist. He didn't just tell you that you were talented, he helped you understand what you could become if you were willing to put in the work. Meanwhile, Tommy's own career continued to flourish. After graduating from Curtis Institute, he was accepted into the Young Artist program at the Cleveland Orchestra, one of the most prestigious training grounds for classical musicians. His performances there attracted attention from concert presenters and recording companies, leading to solo engagements with orchestras around the world. But Tommy never forgot the lessons he had learned about the responsibility that comes with opportunity. Even as his career was taking off, he made time to work with the Morrison Music Foundation, teaching masterclasses for young pianists and serving as a mentor for students who were facing the same kinds of challenges he had once overcome. His teaching philosophy was deeply influenced by his own experience and by the example Elvis had set. Technical perfection is important, Tommy would tell his students, but what really matters is your ability to communicate emotion through music. The audience doesn't care how many notes you can play per minute. They care about whether your music moves them, whether it helps them feel something they need to feel. Tommy also made sure that his own success benefited the community that had supported him. He established a scholarship program for Brownsville students pursuing higher education, regardless of their field of study. He regularly performed benefit concerts to support local charities and community organizations. When he married his wife Sarah, a violinist he met while studying at Curtis, they chose to have their wedding reception at Morrison's barbershop, transformed for the evening into an elegant venue with Tommy's baby grand piano as the centerpiece. Elvis attended the wedding, sitting quietly in the back and applauding along with everyone else when Tommy and Sarah performed a duet they had written for the occasion. Frank Morrison, now in his 70s, gave a speech at the reception that summarized what the previous decade had meant to his family. 10 years ago, my son was playing broken melodies on a broken piano, and I was a barber who didn't know how to help his child's dreams come true. Tonight, Tommy is a professional musician, married to a wonderful woman, and I'm still a barber, but now I know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is recognize something beautiful and help it grow. The barbershop itself had become something of a pilgrimage site for music lovers and people interested in stories of generosity and human potential. Visitors would come from across the country to see where Elvis had discovered Tommy, to sit in the chair where the king of rock and roll had received a simple haircut, and to hear Frank tell the story of how one Tuesday afternoon had changed everything. Frank was always gracious with visitors, understanding that people were inspired by the story and wanted to connect with it personally. But he was careful to emphasize that the real message wasn't about celebrity encounters or dramatic rescue stories. It was about paying attention to the people around you and recognizing that everyone has something valuable to offer if someone is willing to look for it. Elvis didn't create Tommy's talent, Frank would explain to visitors. Tommy always had that gift. What Elvis did was recognize it and provide the resources to develop it. But that kind of recognition and support can come from anyone who cares enough to pay attention. The barbershop remained operational, though Frank gradually reduced his hours as he aged. The Tuesday afternoon slot that had been so significant in their family's history was preserved as a time for community events, sometimes impromptu concerts by foundation students, sometimes discussions about local history, sometimes simply a time for neighbors to gather and connect with each other. The piano upstairs, now properly tuned and maintained, continued to be played regularly. Tommy's younger cousins, inspired by his success, had begun learning music themselves. The sound of piano practice drifting down to the barbershop had become a comforting constant, a reminder of dreams pursued and potential realized. Elvis's own legacy was enriched by his relationship with the Morrison family and the foundation that grew from it. While he was known primarily for his revolutionary contributions to popular music, his work with young classical musicians demonstrated his broader understanding of music's power to transform lives regardless of genre or style. Music historians and biographers who studied Elvis's later years often pointed to his support of the Morrison Music Foundation as evidence of his evolving understanding of his own role and responsibilities. As he matured as an artist and as a person, he became increasingly interested in using his success to create opportunities for others rather than simply accumulating more success for himself. Elvis's work with young musicians represented a different kind of performance, observed Dr. Peter Guralnick, a prominent Elvis biographer. Instead of performing for audiences, he was performing acts of generosity and mentorship that had lasting impact on individual lives and on communities. The foundation continued to grow and evolve long after Elvis's death in 1977. Tommy Morrison, now established as a major figure in classical music, took a more active role in its leadership, helping to expand its programs and increase its reach. By the 1990s, the foundation was serving students in 6 states and had developed partnerships with major music schools and orchestras. But the foundation's core mission remained unchanged: to identify and nurture musical talent in young people who might not otherwise have access to high-quality instruction and performance opportunities. Every student who participated in foundation programs learned not only music but also the values that had guided Elvis's original involvement: humility, hard work, respect for others, and the responsibility to help the next generation. As Tommy entered his 40s, he began to think more seriously about his own legacy and how to ensure that the lessons he had learned would continue to benefit future generations. He had become one of the most respected pianists of his generation, performing with the world's leading orchestras and recording acclaimed albums of both classical and contemporary music. But he was proudest of his work with young musicians and his role in continuing the mission that Elvis had begun with a simple act of recognition and support. Elvis saw something in a 12-year-old boy that even the boy didn't fully understand, Tommy would tell audiences when he spoke about his experiences. He didn't just give me piano lessons or a better instrument. He gave me the confidence to believe that my dreams were valid and achievable. The impact of that confidence extended beyond music into every aspect of Tommy's life and career. He approached performance opportunities, educational challenges, and professional relationships with the self-assurance that comes from knowing that someone believed in him when it mattered most. This confidence also influenced his relationships with other musicians and his approach to collaboration. Instead of viewing other performers as competition, he saw them as colleagues in the shared mission of creating beautiful music and meaningful artistic experiences. This collaborative spirit made him a sought-after chamber music partner and a popular choice for orchestral collaborations. Tommy's recording career reflected his broad musical interests and his desire to make classical music accessible to wider audiences. His albums included traditional classical repertoire, but also contemporary works, jazz-influenced pieces, and even some arrangements of Elvis Presley songs that honored his mentor while showcasing the sophistication that classical training could bring to popular music. One of his most successful recordings was an album called Small Town Dreams, which featured piano arrangements of songs that had been important to his musical development, including pieces he had first learned on the old upright piano in his father's apartment. The album's liner notes told the story of his discovery by Elvis and included photographs of Morrison's barbershop, both past and present. The album was dedicated to Elvis Presley, who heard music in a broken piano and saw potential in a small-town boy, and to all the teachers, mentors, and supporters who helped dreams become reality. It became one of the best-selling classical albums of its year and introduced Tommy's story to audiences around the world. Frank Morrison lived to see his son's greatest professional triumphs, including Grammy nominations, international acclaim, and recognition as one of the leading pianists of his generation. But he was most proud of Tommy's character and values, which had remained consistent despite his success and fame. Elvis taught Tommy that talent is a gift that should be shared, not hoarded, Frank reflected in one of his last interviews before his death at age 85. Tommy has never forgotten that lesson, and he's passed it on to everyone he's taught and mentored. Frank's funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the story that began in his barbershop. Tommy performed a memorial concert that included his father's favorite pieces, and the Morrison Music Foundation established a scholarship in Frank's name for children from working-class families who demonstrated both musical ability and strong character. Today, more than 50 years after that Tuesday afternoon in 1973, the Morrison Music Foundation has helped over 2,000 young musicians pursue their dreams. Many have gone on to professional careers in music, while others have incorporated their musical training into other fields, becoming doctors who play in community orchestras, teachers who use music in their classrooms, and business leaders who support arts organizations in their communities. The foundation's impact extends beyond individual success stories to broader changes in how musical education is approached in rural and underserved communities. Its model of combining technical instruction with mentorship, performance opportunities, and community support has been adopted by youth development programs across the country. Tommy Morrison continues to perform and teach, though he has gradually shifted his focus toward education and mentorship. He serves as professor of piano at the Eastman School of Music and continues to work actively with the foundation that bears his family's name. Morrison's barbershop remains in operation, now run by Frank's great-nephew, who learned the trade from Frank himself and continues the family tradition of treating every customer with respect and care. The barber chair where Elvis sat is still in use, and the apartment upstairs still houses the baby grand piano that transformed Tommy's musical development. The story of Elvis Presley's visit to a small-town barbershop has become more than just a tale of individual generosity and talent recognition. It has become a parable about the power of paying attention to the people around us, recognizing potential where others might see only ordinary circumstances, and understanding that the greatest investments are often made not in buildings or businesses, but in human possibilities. The plaque that hangs in Morrison's barbershop today reads, "On this site in 1973, humility met talent, generosity met need, and dreams became reality. May all who enter here be reminded that everyone has something valuable to offer, and everyone deserves someone who believes in their potential." The legacy of that Tuesday afternoon continues to inspire new generations of musicians, educators, and community leaders who understand that the most profound changes often begin with the simplest acts of recognition and support. Tommy Morrison's story has been featured in documentaries, books, and educational programs that teach young people about the importance of pursuing their dreams while remaining grounded in the values of hard work, humility, and service to others. In schools across America, music teachers use Tommy's story to encourage students who might be struggling with self-doubt or discouragement. They remind their pupils that even the greatest musicians started with basic skills and developed their abilities through practice, dedication, and the support of people who believed in them. The story also resonates with parents and community members who are looking for ways to support the young people in their lives. Frank Morrison's example shows that you don't need to be wealthy or highly educated to recognize talent and find ways to nurture it. Sometimes the most important thing is simply paying attention and being willing to ask for help when you encounter abilities that exceed your own knowledge or resources. Elvis Presley's role in the story continues to surprise people who knew him primarily as an entertainer. His genuine interest in classical music, his respect for serious musicians, and his commitment to supporting young talent revealed aspects of his character that were often overshadowed by his celebrity status and commercial success. The Morrison family story became part of the broader narrative of Elvis's philanthropy and community involvement, demonstrating that his generosity extended far beyond the well-publicized charitable events and donations that made headlines. His willingness to invest time, attention, and resources in individual relationships and long-term commitments showed a depth of character that matched his artistic achievements. Today, visitors to Morrison's barbershop often ask about the lasting impact of Elvis's intervention in Tommy's life. The answer is visible not just in Tommy's successful career, but in the hundreds of students who have benefited from the Morrison Music Foundation, the community programs that grew from their example, and the continuing commitment to recognizing and nurturing potential wherever it appears. The story reminds us that the greatest gifts we can give are often not material objects, but recognition, encouragement, and the opportunity for people to become the best versions of themselves. Elvis Presley understood this truth, and his decision to act on it that Tuesday afternoon in Brownsville created ripples that continue to spread more than 50 years later. If this story moved you, consider the young people in your own community who might benefit from recognition, encouragement, and support. Like Elvis discovered, sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, played by people whose potential is waiting to be recognized and nurtured by someone who cares enough to listen.